Okay, let's call this chapter 11, part 3. And we're in the long run now. And the long run means I'm going to let you change any of the factors of production that you want. None of them are fixed. Sometimes that's good for our average costs, sometimes it's bad. And we refer to this phenomenon as returns to scale. Sometimes increasing returns, sometimes decreasing. So let's go ahead and walk through these possibilities. With all of our factors being changeable in the long run, you basically got three possible scenarios. You can get bigger and it can make things worse. You can get bigger and it can make things better. Or you can get bigger and it doesn't seem to make any change at all. When you see that things are getting better, i.e. your average costs are dropping as you increase output, this is what we refer to as increasing returns to scale. So you might imagine doubling the size of the factory and the labor and all of your factors, and all of a sudden you quadruple the amount of output. That would imply that your average costs are falling as you got bigger in terms of scale. If you double that factory and all of your labor and all your factors up and it doesn't make any difference at all, then you are dealing with an increase in scale, but no change in your long run average costs. We refer to this as constant returns to scale. And down here, if you increase your quantity and you see that this actually makes your costs worse on average, then this is what we refer to as decreasing returns to scale. Occasionally you'll hear this green one as economies of scale, and they'll talk about this red one as diseconomies. It's the same thing. Let's go ahead and graph these. For the traditional LRAC, the early marginalists, Alfred Marshall in particular, argued that you would have every single firm going through a period of increasing returns to scale. This is our good portion over here where LRAC is dropping. So increasing or economies of scale. And then you'd have an area where it was constant. They're getting bigger in terms of Q, right? But it's not doing anything to their costs. And then there was sort of a natural limit from Marshall's perspective on how big a firm could get, because he thought that they would all start experiencing decreasing returns to scale. LRAC starts going up as Q gets bigger. So this is your traditional region, or your curve with three different regions. And I want you to start thinking about this as essentially kind of a roadmap of all of the short run possibilities. So at any given short run, you might be stuck with a short run average total cost that looks like this. But if I let you double up on all your factors, you might be able to jump down here and get to a better short run average total cost. And of course, as you keep doubling, you keep coming up with new short run average total costs, but they're all just one point or another on this LRAC. Okay, so firms, especially when we start talking about them in chapter 12, if they're doing well and they're making a profit, they're all going to start wondering about whether or not they should, get bigger and expand, and that's going to depend on their long run costs. So why would we ever expect to see a firm experiencing increasing returns to scale? As you get bigger and bigger, you don't have UPS and FedEx deliver you your inputs in boxes anymore. You probably start hiring semis. You start using trains. All of these things are going to start decreasing your transportation costs. Even small businesses do this. I worked for a guy that owned a pool table store, and he started recognizing he could get an edge on his competition if he ordered in bulk. And he would get not only better prices, but when he was shipping the rock playing surface of a pool table, if he could bring them in bulk, he could put them on a semi and he would pay much, much lower costs. And as you might imagine, the costs of moving a 4.5 by 9 foot piece of rock were really expensive. So any edge that we could get there usually made a big difference in terms of our being able to come to market at a price that was competitive. Another thing that happens is when my former boss would buy pool tables in larger bulk, the company's accounting firm or accountants didn't have to mess around with accounts receivables as often. It was one transaction, it was less paperwork, so they were willing to pass on some of those savings. He also did similar things whenever he would buy pool cues. He wouldn't buy just one, he'd buy a dozen to get a price break, and he'd pay for it immediately so that there wasn't even an accounts receivable to keep track of. He'd get a better price because of that. All of this was only possible when he was buying inputs in larger quantities. And then the one that's probably on your mind is that the bigger you get, sometimes there are methods of production, maybe that require large fixed cost outlays, and they only make sense if you are actually producing at a relatively high level of output. The more output you create, the more of those technologies start to be cost feasible. So all of these can help to lower your LRAC and give you an increasing return to scale as you get bigger. Decreasing returns to scale are a little harder to conjure up in your mind, but not so bad once you start thinking about it. Once a firm gets really, really big, just trying to keep track of the whole entire production process gets more and more difficult. And at times you will see that they are going to end up very management heavy. And if you end up with too many managers and not enough folks who are actually, producing products, those managers add to cost, but they may not be contributing much in terms of helping production. That can make your costs worse. Large firms are also more likely to get sued. Very unlikely to sue tiny firms because they don't have any money, especially with limited liability. So you are more litigation prone, you probably have to pay more legal fees, maybe even keep a lawyer on retainer. All this is going to make your costs worse for larger firms. Think about McDonald's getting sued for hot coffee, these kinds of things. Okay. Another thing that pops up is organized labor. Small mom and pop shops almost never have enough employees that unionization makes sense. But once a firm gets very, very large and has an organized workforce, it is usually not too long before that organized workforce starts trying to improve the wage bargain in their favor. All of these, of course, would lead to the upward piece of the LRAC, the part where it is getting worse for you as quantity goes up. Okay, so there's a few ideas about decreasing returns to scale. We'll come back to this at the end of chapter 12 when we start discussing long-run equilibrium in perfectly competitive markets. So just sort of bookmark it in your brain for right now.